Commander Fox pulled the trigger, and the closest the galaxy ever came to stopping Order 66 died on the floor of a Coruscant hangar. The clone the 500 first called Fives had spent the days preceding that moment doing something the architecture embedded in his skull was specifically designed to prevent. Working from a chip extracted from a dead comrade's brain, he traced the Order 66 mechanism toward its origin, was framed through Palpatine's management of the crisis, had his findings processed and dismissed through institutional channels designed to handle exactly this kind of inconvenient discovery, escaped custody, reached Coruscant, and got Rex into the same room with everything he knew. The inhibitor chips, the sleeper command sitting in every clone's brainstem. What was coming for the Jedi? All of it named, in that room, by a man who had cracked the conspiracy from inside and was still talking when the order came down to apprehend him. Fox executed the order. One shot. The truth sealed itself behind that trigger pull, and didn't reopen until the Jedi were already dead. Fans despise Fox for this, and the intensity of that reaction points at something the Star Wars conversation keeps approaching without naming. Fox wasn't rogue. He wasn't operating from a personal agenda. He wasn't even wrong about his orders. Fox was doing exactly what the Republic spent a decade engineering him to do, and that precision is the indictment of the system that built him. Every clone this audience can't forgive, Fox, Dogma, Crosshair, Slick, was the Republic's clone program performing to specification. Rex wasn't the ideal product the system was working toward. Rex was a malfunction, and he is the moral y-axis against which this entire case is measured. A democratic government mass-manufactured human beings for obedience, wrote the budget allocations into Senate records, and never asked what it costs a person to be made docile before they're old enough to understand what docility means. This isn't a ranking. The tier list exists already, and it answers nothing worth arguing. This is a prosecution, and the defendant is the Republic's clone program itself. Start with Dogma, because Dogma is where the audience's own moral reasoning does its hardest work without landing a verdict. The Umbara arc places the 501st Legion under General Pong Krell, a Jedi Master who has secretly turned to the dark side and is routing battalions through suicidal tactical decisions on purpose. The mathematics of Krell's orders don't resolve into survivable outcomes at any confidence level a battlefield soldier can trust. Fives names this explicitly, in plain language, to anyone within earshot. Rex carries the weight of contradictory loyalties in visible silence across every scene. By the arc's end, the entire 501st reaches mutiny, and the mutiny is justified by everything it prevents. Through every grinding episode of it, Dogma enforces the chain of command against his own brothers. He arrests Fives for insubordination. He processes Krell's directives against his own squad with a consistency that registers, to the audience and to the clones beside him, as something more than compliance. For Dogma, the chain of command isn't an institutional structure one chooses to respect or not. It's the organizing framework of reality itself, the thing that gives meaning to action and coherence to identity. Uncertainty about authority doesn't register as legitimate moral hesitation. It registers as the primary betrayal, not the orders that are getting people killed, but the subordinate's act of noticing that they are. One viewer, describing the experience of watching this arc, identified it as very painful to watch, in no small part because it's very realistic, the way that some people cling to authority, even when that authority is clearly rotten and toxic. What that viewer was reaching toward, what the fan conversation keeps circling in its debates about how much blame Dogma deserves, is a documented human phenomenon. In 1961, psychologist Stanley Milgram found that 65% of ordinary adults with full cognitive freedom delivered what they believed were lethal electric shocks to strangers, solely because an authority figure in a lab coat instructed them to continue. Dogma is that result, with the behavioral modification chip installed before adolescence, and 9 years of daily institutional reinforcement behind it. The conditioning worked on him at a depth that went well below tactical training. And that depth isn't a personal character flaw on display. It's the system succeeding at the precise thing it designed him to do. The anger at Dogma is legitimate. Men died in the gap between Krell's orders and survivable tactics, and Dogma ran the mechanism that processed those orders with minimal friction. His eventual act, shooting Krell once the betrayal became factually undeniable, is framed as the show's gesture toward moral rupture. The Republic then arrested him for the defiance, even after the defiance proved necessary. The institution that shaped him into the instrument of Krell's authority punished the moment the instrument finally broke. Consumed by the system in both directions, at every stage of his arc, with the system's internal logic holding all the way through, including at the moment it swallowed the man it had made. Slick looks, on first contact, like the counter-argument to everything the prosecution has established. The clone who broke the conditioning, who arrived at genuine political clarity about his own exploitation, who named the thing the Republic's commissioning language carefully obscured. His analysis was accurate on every count. The accelerated aging built into his biology would kill him decades before a natural lifespan concluded. Clone troopers reached combat readiness around age 10, after 9 years of forced biological development, a timeline the Republic's contracting documentation treated as an engineering specification rather than a human cost. The legal status the Republic assigned him was property, not person, a fact the institution's documentation avoided naming without ever quite denying. Behavioral modification had shaped his formation from before he could choose an alternative framework. If any clone in the Grand Army had genuine grounds for political resistance, Slick found them, and named them out loud in a room not designed to hear that argument. Then he reportedly fed separatist intelligence that endangered his brothers. He sabotaged their equipment. He compromised men sleeping in the same barracks who wore his face and carried the same formation, and had none of the political clarity he had somehow reached. Fans drawn to his ideological position run immediately into his method, and the collision is brutal precisely because both responses are defensible simultaneously. His analysis was right. Through the tools he chose, Slick used the people he claimed to be liberating as acceptable collateral in a fight he decided to wage on their behalf, without their knowledge or consent. The thing that lives inside that collision, the part the fan conversation keeps circling without settling, is that the system's damage traveled with him when he escaped the conditioning. The Republic's formation gave him the tools of violence and covert action, and when he broke free of its ideology, those were the tools his hands reached for. His compliance-shaped years and his eventual rebellion carry the institution's fingerprints with equal clarity. Rex, watching the aftermath of Slick's exposure, didn't respond with hatred. What registered in Rex was grief, colder and heavier than anger, for a brother who arrived at a real argument and then chose the only method the system had actually taught him. Crosshair bridges the argument from Republic into Empire, and his arc in the Bad Batch makes the chip question unavoidable in a way the earlier cases don't quite force. Clone Force 99's genetic mutations had blunted the inhibitor chip's effectiveness for most of the squad. Crosshair carried no such biological accident, and when Order 66 executes, his inhibitor chip activates and aligns with pre-existing inclinations. He stays when his brothers leave. He serves the Empire with the technical precision he was engineered to deliver. Controlled, exact, calibrated to the function assigned to him, with a thoroughness that reads as performance to specification rather than personal conviction. The lines fans identify as irreversible, civilian executions, repeated betrayals of his brothers, aren't the most extreme actions any clone commits across the full franchise history. They register as unforgivable because of the precision with which they're carried out, because in those scenes, the gap between capability and conscience isn't blurred by chaos or heat. It's simply absent. The fan debate over how much of his conduct the chip explains refuses to resolve cleanly across Crosshair's arc, and that refusal is honest rather than evasive. There is a point in Crosshair's story where chip and genuine inclination become functionally indistinguishable. where the behavioral output looks identical regardless of mechanism. And the show doesn't answer the question cleanly, because the honest answer doesn't resolve cleanly. The Empire inherited the Republic's design and stripped away the democratic rhetoric surrounding it. Crosshair's eventual movement toward his brothers stays morally open because civilian deaths can't be retroactively undone, and reconciliation and full accounting aren't the same transaction. The system built him so thoroughly that the question of what was override and what was choice may simply be invisible from outside the architecture. And that invisibility is the thesis stated in character form across Crosshair's arc. RC-1262 carries a specific grief that deserves acknowledgement before the larger argument absorbs it. Star Wars Republic Commando gave players Delta Squad, and gave Scorch a personality the franchise had almost never delivered for a clone before. Sardonic, specific, warm in the way that develops in someone who handles demolition for a living, and has built a complicated personal arrangement with the concept of mortality. EU fans who grew up with that game didn't love Scorch as a category of clone character. They loved a particular voice, a specific cadence of dark humor, a human being whose individuality felt earned through hours of play rather than assigned by narrative function. That form of clone personhood, granular, particular, resistant to abstraction, is what the Legends era represented at its best, and it created an investment later creative decisions would either honor or fracture. Disney's canon introduced a Scorch in The Bad Batch, operating as an Imperial enforcer, executing Imperial directives with the clean efficiency of a manufactured instrument. The EU community's response wasn't quiet disappointment. The argument circulating in those spaces, that the creative teams involved don't understand what EU clones actually are, captures something genuine about two irreconcilable philosophies of what clone personhood means and what the franchise owes its own continuity. Both versions carry the same designation and the same face. The Legend Scorch is evidence the system failed to suppress a particular human being. Disney's version is evidence the system succeeded. Placed against each other, they aren't contradictory readings of the same character. They're the Republic's clone program displaying its two possible outcomes in the same armor. EU loyalists' grief over what happened to RC-1262 is, at its foundation, the same grief this prosecution has been building since Dogma, arrived at through a different medium and a different era of storytelling, but pointing at the same institutional indictment. CC-1010 commanded the Coruscant Guard, and that assignment is where the prosecution's case against Fox turns structural rather than emotional. Clone troopers who fought on Geonosis or Umbara or any contested battlefield in the Outer Rim operated in genuine fog of war. Incomplete information, hostile fire, decisions made under conditions where independent verification of an order's legitimacy was practically impossible. Fox operated in the opposite environment. The Coruscant Guard functioned at the political and administrative heart of the Republic, the Senate District, the corridors adjacent to the Chancellor's residence, the full judicial architecture of galactic civilization within walking distance. Functionally, CC-1010 was a law enforcement officer. He policed the Republic's own citizens, its senators, its Jedi. His operational environment was the most information-rich available to any commander in the Grand Army, with institutional chains of command reaching toward oversight in every direction. That positional distinction changes the moral weight of his obedience considerably. Dogma operated under a commanding officer actively deceiving him, under fire, in an environment where independent verification was structurally blocked. Crosshair operated with a chip firing in the chaos of Order 66's simultaneous galaxy-wide execution. Fox operated in peacetime law enforcement on the galactic capital, surrounded by the Republic's full legal apparatus, in a command role that required constant engagement with the political context of every directive he received. If any clone in the Grand Army occupied an environment where moral hesitation wasn't just ethically desirable, but practically available, where the institutional room to pause and think actually existed, it was the commander of the Coruscant Guard. His own brothers registered the difference. Other clones, people sharing his DNA, his conditioning, his exact institutional formation, explicitly identified his practice of carrying out any order given without question as notable, even within a core built entirely around compliance. Fox was performing at the outer calibration edge of his specification, optimized for political enforcement in ways his brothers found worth naming out loud. His particular brand of blunt, aggressive efficiency wasn't aberrant within the clone program. The Coruscant Guard's function specifically demanded that calibration, and Fox held it with the consistency of someone who had never been offered a different frame for what holding it meant. Now the hanger, again. Palpatine had managed the crisis with the precision that defines everything he touches. Fives classified as paranoid, his testimony contaminated by a neural pathogen affecting his cognition, his mental state questioned by the very system whose neurological intervention he was documenting. He reached Coruscant anyway. He got Rex into the same room anyway. The truth was closer to surviving in that moment than it would be at any point until the Jedi were already dead, and the Republic had already become the empire its own legislation had made possible. An order came down. Fox executed it. The conspiracy sealed itself with a tidiness that should have troubled someone in the chain of command, and it troubled no one. Count 2 comes from the Clone Wars, when Ahsoka Tano was framed for a bombing at the Jedi Temple and a murder she didn't commit. Fox pursued a Jedi Padawan with years of documented service in the Grand Army's own campaigns, without independent investigation, without pause for the observable contradiction between the charges filed and the record of the person named in them. The order existed. Fox enforced it. Same pattern, same outcome. The most institutionally transparent environment in the Republic, and the commander of its law enforcement apparatus twice chose the directive over the visible human being in front of him. Fox wasn't malicious in either incident. Thoroughness was the whole problem. The Republic built an administrator, placed him at the center of its law enforcement architecture, and the result was one dead clone who knew too much, and one Jedi nearly executed by the institution that trained her. The Republic's design specification for its Grand Army included the phrase, "more docile than their genetic donor." The donor was Jango Fett, a free man, a bounty hunter who answered to no institution, and whose independence was, from the program's management perspective, a liability to be corrected in the copies. On Kamino, in facilities no senator had personally toured and no Jedi had formally inspected, a biochip was installed in every developing clone, before language, before memory, before any capacity to resist the procedure. Conceived originally by Jedi Master Sifo Dyas as a safeguard against rogue Jedi, the chip was retooled after his death by Palpatine and Count Dooku to encode Order 66 across the entire clone army. The Kaminoans understood the full architecture and said nothing. By the time a clone trooper sealed his armor for the first time, he had already spent 9 years in accelerated biological development and daily behavioral conditioning, becoming battle-ready around age 10. 9 years of training was simultaneously 9 years of conditioning, hierarchy as the organizing principle of reality, obedience as the highest expression of a soldier's worth, independent judgment framed consistently as the primary threat to unit cohesion and effective command. The men who emerged were tactically sophisticated, personally loyal to the brothers beside them, and neurologically managed at a level the Republic's own citizens would have found deeply disturbing if anyone had described the specifics in plain language. These clones couldn't vote, hold civil rank, own property, or petition the Senate that their labor was actively defending. In the Republic's legal framework, they were property, a fact the institution's language carefully obscured without ever quite denying. The word slave does not appear in the commissioning records, but the architecture the records describe is difficult to distinguish from the concept they avoid naming. CT-7567, the clone the Grand Army called Rex, is what makes the prosecution's case possible at all. Without him, the argument that the system could have produced something different remains theoretical. He questioned orders during active campaigns while continuing to serve. He built relationships across command structures designed to prevent those relationships from outweighing institutional directives. He developed conscience against the daily current of conditioning built specifically to suppress it. When the siege of Mandalore concluded and the order came, Ahsoka had already created the possibility of removing his inhibitor chip before it executed, because years of choosing the brother over the mandate had cracked the architecture wide enough to step through deliberately when the moment arrived. Rex isn't extraordinary because of a lucky accident in his biology. He is extraordinary because of what preceded the chip's removal. Years of operating inside a conditioning architecture built to prevent the exact conscience he developed anyway. A friendship that mattered more than the mandate, a habit of genuine hesitation, a man who chose the person beside him over the institutional directive and kept choosing it, over and over, until the gap was wide enough to act through. That isn't passive luck. That is a person choosing repeatedly against the current of everything designed to make the choice structurally impossible. Most of the clones couldn't do it. The system wasn't designed to permit it. Dogma held the rulebook because the conditioning ran deep and the system rewarded him for holding it. Slick escaped the ideology and carried the institution's tools with him when he left. Crosshair served the Empire with the precision the Republic had calibrated him to deliver, and the question of chip versus genuine choice stays open because the system built him so thoroughly that the distinction may be invisible from outside the architecture. Fox administered the Republic's will at two moments when the visible human cost was as clear as it would ever be, and administered it cleanly both times. None of them were uniquely broken men. All of them were the product performing to the specification that funded them, shaped by a program that never once asked whether the shaping itself was the crime. Back in that Coruscant hangar, Fives used his last breath to tell Rex he had been right. Rex heard it, kneeling over a dying brother whose testimony had been systematically discredited through every available institutional channel. Months later, when the order came down across the galaxy, Rex was the one clone commander who didn't execute it. The Republic built a man to pull that trigger, trained him to feel nothing but duty when he did, gave him a district to police, a chain of command to serve, a specification that called for docility, and called the whole arrangement governance. The answer to why it kept happening was sitting in Senate appropriations records the entire time, in a program whose commissioning language described human beings as products, requiring correction before they could be useful. The institution that wrote those records was the last one with any interest in reading them clearly, and so the trigger kept getting pulled, and the system kept calling each pull a job well done. Subscribe for more stories like this.